Reputable medical authority Kim Kardashian recently posted to her 363 million Instagram followers about her trip to get a full-body MRI scan at a company called Pronuvo. Paris Hilton replied that she loves them.
What do we say when you're cancer-free, Paris?
Sliving.
That's hot.
Kris Kardashian, Cindy Crawford and Miranda Kerr, or as I like to think of them, America's real medical association, have all promoted the same company. So, should you be influenced by the world's biggest influencer and get a full-body MRI scan, or one of the screening ultrasound scans that are advertised, or a CT coronary angiogram? Kim said in her post, somewhat confusingly, that it was like getting an MRI scan without radiation. Well, it wasn't like getting an MRI scan, Kim. It was an MRI scan, and they all use radiation, but not ionizing radiation like X-rays, which I assume is what she meant. Poor non-ionizing EM radiation. It never gets no respect. But Kim can't be expected to be an expert in law, medicine, and physics, so basic science errors aside, should you do the same thing? I'm going to focus on imaging in this video, but really the question could be, should you undergo any of the booming industry of consumer-directed commercial medical testing? Kim is hardly the first celebrity to promote full-body scans. The rest might not be quite as famous of her, but there is a steady stream of celebrities, influencers, and podcasters. The biohacking, longevity, tech bro crowd are very keen on them and promote them readily, and they all talk about their life-saving abilities. And sure enough, every time one of these people posts on Twitter or Instagram, the comments are filled with doctors who are destined to cry like Cassandra and be ignored. Please don't do this. Pronuvo, I think, has been the most successful in promoting the idea that you need to fork over $2,500 to catch disease early. And indeed, Kim regurgitated their sales copy, and the promise is very easy to sell. She said that Pronuvo, the scan has the ability to detect cancer and diseases such as aneurysms in its earliest stages before symptoms arise, which sounds great. Other examples of companies in this rapidly growing sector are Nico Health, which was actually started by the co-founder of Spotify, Daniel Ek. I hope I'm saying all those names correctly. And another company called Ezra, who actually said they saw an abnormal uptick in signups after Kim's post. Some of the investors in this field include Anne Wojcicki, the co-founder of 23andMe, another biotech company whose services I'd caution against using, and she's probably better known to YouTubers as Susan's sister. Cindy Crawford I mentioned earlier, and lots of very high-profile investment firms and VCs. Pronuvo actually raised $70 million and Nico Health $65 million in some preliminary round of funding. Don't ask me what that all means. I don't understand it. But I just mention all this to illustrate how much money is fueling this boom in medical imaging. Never forget, the biotech sector attracts such huge attention and massive investment because it is wildly profitable. But maybe you're one of those people who really believes in these companies. Maybe you invested in Theranos because they were motivated just by the desire to help people and change the world. I have actually made a video going over these concepts in more detail, so if you do want a deeper understanding of some of the science, then do check that out afterwards. But after seeing Kim in her branded scrubs, I thought I'd quickly knock one out. A video, where I focus on why doctors don't advise people to get full-body MRI scans. Now, I am on holiday at the moment, so please excuse the change in setup and my increasingly shiny face. I have once again had to switch off the ceiling fan for your listening pleasure. I'm not sure how much difference it's going to make because my laptop sounds like it's going to take off. It's louder even than the Indian Air Force, who are literally doing maneuvers and buzzing the top of the building every now and again. So advance apologies. It really is getting exceedingly hot in here, and I don't know if maybe my face is shiny enough to be used as one of those chrome balls by VFX artists. It's a bit of a niche reference, but Captain Disillusion, if you are watching, please weigh in on whether I am shiny enough. He's not watching, is he? It's a one-way relationship. It's a parasocial relationship. The love is unrequited. Oh, Captain, my Captain.
I am considering offering full body scans here at Sacred Heart. What do you think?
I think showing perfectly healthy people every harmless imperfection in their body just to scare them into taking invasive and often pointless tests is an unholy sin.
For anyone new to the channel, welcome. I'm a cardiologist, and of relevance to this particular topic, I'm also accredited in cardiac CT, ultrasound, and MRI, and did 3 years doctoral research in MRI. And so I think I've got a bit of experience in the field, and I'm going to consider a few questions for this video. Number one, what are the main problems? Number two, surely it's just information. I mean, that can't be bad, can it? Number three, is this cost effective? I was actually quite intrigued by the fact that all the top comments under Kim's post were not about the concerns that I have about whether this is even effective. They seem to assume it was effective, it was valuable, but they were complaining that this is out of reach for most people because it's so expensive. So should insurance or healthcare systems be paying for this? And number four, why do I have a problem with people wanting to take more control over their health? So what are the problems? Well, the first one is false positives. Now, the promise of these scans is that they can pick up abnormalities, and that gives the impression that there can be clearly labeled abnormal and normal, but actually that's very far from the case. Biology rarely deals in these clear binary distinctions like that. There's always a huge grey area. Indeed, managing the uncertainty inherent to human biology is one of the central tenets of medicine, and practicing it and getting good at it is one of the hardest skills to master. The people who are the experts at managing this are often the most experienced doctors, and they're very honest with their patients about the limitations of what we can achieve with our technology, and they don't sound like the sales patter of these private companies. No medical test is 100% accurate. There's always a margin of error. Even the most reliable modern medical tests can be rendered completely unhelpful if you just test everybody unselected due to some basic simple statistics. If you take the population as a whole, thankfully, the rate of disease is low. Diseases are rare. So your pre-test probability of having some cancer growing is, thankfully, low. This means the true positive rate is low. Therefore, even with a positive test result, there's a high likelihood that that is a false positive. This is especially true for young and healthy populations whose pre-test probability is lowest because they're at the lowest risk. So actually, in those cases, the likelihood that a positive test result is a true positive is actually orders of magnitude lower than it being a false positive. In other words, a positive test is most likely to be untrue. This is why in clinical practice, we don't book tests for everybody. We have to have a high index of suspicion that we're going to find something. Our pre-test probability has got to justify ordering the test. If you don't select who you scan, you can be subject to something called the base rate fallacy, where you only think about the accuracy of the test and you don't think about the frequency of the disease in the general population. A 99% accurate test, which typically in scanning terms means high sensitivity but low specificity, can produce way more false positives than true positives. For example, if you scan just 1,000 people unselected and you're looking for a disease with a 1% prevalence. Again, if you want more detail, I made another short video about this specific statistical concept, but under that video, a lot of statistically minded people said, well, in that case, just repeat the test and your likelihood of a false positive will massively drop. And that is, of course, true. And that's what we do. We then suggest repeating the scan. But that comes with its own problems, which we'll get onto. Then, of course, there are false negatives, which are the opposite. And this is where a real abnormality is missed. And again, this can happen on scans. And this can have devastating consequences if it leads to false reassurance or it leads to somebody neglecting to act on symptoms that develop later on. But perhaps none of these are as big a problem as incidentalomas. Incidentaloma is the name given to something that's found on a scan, a blob, a spot, a lump, a thingy, a doodad. We all have them. The classic example is pulmonary nodules, but you can find them anywhere in the body. Is that 5mm lump in the lung a harmless nodule, or is it lung cancer? I don't know. So the radiologist will obviously suggest repeating the scan in a few months' time. This happens incredibly commonly. In fact, 20 to 40% of scans ordered for some clinical concern, i.e. not screening scans, but tests ordered in the hospital, will find an incidentaloma. And out of that 20 to 40%, 1% goes on to be clinically significant. An incidental finding is a finding that is unrelated to the reason the scan was booked. So if I book a scan for chest pain, but I pick up an adrenal mass, it's harder to interpret what that means. But of course, on an asymptomatic screening test, and screening means the patient has no symptoms, everything is an incidental finding because there is no presenting complaint. I order loads of CT and MRI scans when investigating heart disease, and so I pick up lots lots of incidental lung findings, and all of them need to be followed up. They all have repeat scans, and they all sort of get plugged into the system. And so far in my career, I have found one lung cancer. So a healthy person can go from being a carefree, happy-go-lucky person to a patient in the blink of an eye. You're in the system now. Pulmonary nodule, unclear significance, repeat in 6 months. Imagine the anxiety this could cause. Some people, it can really weigh on their mind, sitting there worrying if they've got cancer.
Mommy, when's Daddy coming home?
He isn't. If only he loved us enough to get a full body scan at Sacred Heart.
Let's talk about some of the more complex stuff, which I think gets to the heart of these emotive anecdotes about my cousin had their cancer caught early and then could undergo life-saving surgery, all thanks to Prenuvo. We'll encounter terms like lead time bias, length bias, overdiagnosis, overtreatment, the illusion of benefit, and these low-risk patients are the most susceptible to these kinds of bias. A very popular medical podcaster who regularly endorses these full-body asymptomatic screening scans as part of their kind of longevity belief, recently shared the story of a young man who, I think he was about in his 30s or 40, which is very young, I'll have you know. Don't anybody say anything otherwise in medical terms. It is actually very young. And he underwent a CT coronary angiogram, which found a narrowing in one of his coronary arteries. And this was hailed as being a great success story because he took charge of his health and he didn't listen to those doctors who who told him that nothing was wrong, and they wouldn't listen to him. And he went on to have stenting to his coronary artery, which was felt to be life-saving. And of course, this was hailed by all the people who I saw responding to it as a huge success story for getting scans done. Now, I've said on this channel many times that modern medicine has many, many flaws. And absolutely, people do have bad experiences at the hands of the medical profession. And there are doctors who don't listen and don't pay attention. But these predatory companies are cynically cashing in on this by saying, these doctors are gaslighting you. They can't find anything wrong with you, but we will. So they run a battery of tests. This is what we call a fishing expedition. It's the realm of the functional medicine doctors, the lifestyle doctors, the people who say, I'm not like other doctors, I think differently. And they'll just send off as much as they can. And eventually something will come back a bit abnormal, whether it's a trace element like selenium or vitamin D, or increasingly these days, testosterone. You know, they'll find a testosterone level that's entirely normal for a 50-year-old man, but lower than a 20-year-old, and they'll say, aha, this is the cause of all your symptoms. And it's a similar concept for scans. This podcaster story is hardly unique. I've got a little collection at home of stories I've collected, mostly from the US, of minor celebrities who have undergone some test and found a ticking time bomb. It's always the same language used, which then led them to undergo some procedure or surgery, which has made them feel much better. You can look at my placebo effect video to see why even ineffective surgeries can make you feel better. But that's kind of a separate tangent. There are no trial data to suggest that man who had the stent needed it. And there are no trial data to suggest it prolonged his life or saved his life. And I say this as a stent implanting doctor. I go into this in more detail in that fake disease video, but the narrative of saving a life and catching things early is, of course, very persuasive and emotive, but normally completely misleading. This is the illusion of benefit. The biohackers, podcasters, longevity bros are all obsessed with testing things as much as possible to catch things early. If only they turned the enthusiasm they have for infrared saunas, ice baths and testosterone therapy to actually being able to read a scientific paper, they would understand that catching things early is far more complicated than it sounds. In fact, you're paradoxically most likely to catch things early that don't benefit from early intervention. Things like micropapillary thyroid cancer, cystic kidney cancer, prostate cancer. We all know if treated early can actually increase harm without improving survival benefit. Let me read you a paragraph from a very good article in the American Journal of Radiology, which I'll link below with all the other references. It can seem unusual for early detection of cancer or provision of more information about a patient's health to be negative. Nonetheless, confusing as it may be, this has been borne out in numerous settings, and they provide 9 separate references here. Likely it relates to multiple factors, including biases of screening, inaccurate human estimates of risk, incomplete knowledge of risk, defensive medicine, patient and provider fear, and social and economic pressure to overdiagnose. It is difficult to recalibrate human cognition, for example, risk estimation, defensive medicine, or to resolve incomplete knowledge about risk without expensive multi-year studies. This clinical perspective focuses on how the known biases of screening help us predict the outcomes occurring with respect to the detection of incidental findings, preferential diagnosis of indolent, low-risk disease, increased cost and morbidity, and unchanged mortality. In other words, low-value care. Length bias is that paradoxical finding I mentioned before, that you're more likely to pick up the indolent, unimportant, slow-changing findings simply because they hang around for years not doing anything. Whereas an aggressive, fast-growing cancer is unlikely to be picked up on a screening scan, and that's why we don't have screening programs in place for things like pancreatic cancer or esophageal cancer, because they don't have success rates anywhere near high enough to justify them. Overdiagnosis and overtreatment are where those abnormalities that would have never gone on to cause a problem are treated. The classic example for a slow-growing cancer like this is prostate cancer. We've got a saying in medicine that men tend to die with prostate cancer, not from prostate cancer, i.e. you will develop cancer of the prostate, but you will die from another cause before it causes any problems. And we know this from post-mortem studies in men who died from other causes. Lead time bias is where you diagnose cancer on a scan before it's actually caused symptoms. So let's give a hypothetical. Say somebody has a cancer that arises in 2020, but it doesn't cause symptoms until 2022, and then it eventually kills them by 2025. So at the time of diagnosis in 2022, they've got an apparent survival of 3 years. But if you scan them and diagnose in 2020, then from their diagnosis to death is now 5 years. So it looks like you've already offered a benefit. The screening has provided benefit, even though we haven't actually given any therapy. So if you now overlay any therapy on top of this, whether it's chemotherapy or essential oils, you're immediately starting with the bias that it looks like the therapy has provided 2 years of extra life expectancy, when it hasn't. This is what leads a lot of people to claim that certain screening programs save lives. In my fake disease video, I talked about a case which still haunts me to this day, of a patient that I was involved with because of my role setting her down a path that led to a complication, a nasty complication involving her thyroid. And in that same American Journal of Radiology article, they also specifically talked about thyroid cancer and compared two countries, the US and South Korea. Over the last few decades, radiologists have been diligently reporting every thyroid nodule they find. The logic was that thyroid nodules are common, but some of them contain cancer, and this can be detected with a biopsy, which was the procedure that caused my patient her terrible injury. And the more biopsies you do, the more cancers you'll detect and the more lives you'll save. I mean, this sounds like it makes sense, right? Well, this is our mechanistic bias. So between 1979 to 2009, rates of thyroid cancer soared in the US, increasing 300%. But death from thyroid cancer remained unchanged. Increasing incidence of a disease without increasing mortality suggests overdiagnosis. Thousands upon thousands of people underwent surgical removal of their thyroid gland with subsequent thyroid hormone replacement therapy without overall survival benefit for the population. In South Korea, the same thing happened. Thyroid cancer rates, again, shot through the roof, increasing 15-fold. But in 2011, the Koreans realized what was going on. And in 2014, South Korea ran a public information campaign to dissuade people from undergoing screening scans for their thyroid. Just think about that for a second in the context of the very aggressive screening programs that are promoted in the US. The US really is an international outlier. I'm not sure people realize quite how much. It's often promoted by celebrities who, by the way, I'm not attacking. I think they feel they're doing a good thing. I saw Chrissy Teigen doing it today for mammograms, and Ryan Reynolds did it recently for colonoscopies, which are done from the age of 45. That's a recent change in the US, which no other country that I'm aware of does from such a young age. In fact, most countries don't recommend colonoscopy screening at all. And, you know, the US really is not comparable to most of its peers it doesn't take a wild imagination to figure out why that is. But anyway, in South Korea, thyroid cancer rates went down significantly, and of course thyroidectomies plummeted, but there was no uptick in the deaths from thyroid cancer in the last few years or so. A similar story is seen with kidney cancer, which is often one that I seem to see in the adverts for these screening companies, and often in replies on Twitter when people have said, a relative got their kidney cancer caught. So I've linked that article below if you want to read more. Then we come on to the knock-on effects. Once you're in the system, you're then under follow-up. You're under investigation for something serious. You might have to declare this on any number of medical or legal forms. You might have difficulty getting health insurance there afterwards. And when it comes to the follow-up scan, you might have to shell out. These can be very expensive depending on which country you're in. Someone has to foot the bill. And when that test happens, it might suggest that you need to have another test done. And maybe that test suggests you have to have a biopsy, or even worse, something like surgery. This snowballing of one test into more is called a cascade of care. And before you know it, there's been a huge expenditure of not only time, money, but also emotion. If you want to read more about cascades of care, I've put some links below. As I said at the beginning of the video, I was intrigued that most of the comments under Kim's post were kind of in the same vein as when she went to her private island during the pandemic, and all the replies were, we can't afford this, you're so out of touch, we're struggling to even make ends meet in a cost of living crisis, which implies in this case they immediately assume that this is important, this is life-saving. They actually say we can't afford these life-saving scans. Incidentally, if you are struggling to make ends meet, please, for the love of God, stop following Kim Kardashian. What are you, a masochist? And while I appreciate this may not be your personal concern as an individual, if everybody goes out to get a Prenuvo full-body scan, then health systems will collapse with all the follow-up scans. Even if just 1% require some additional testing, hospitals can't deal with this, particularly in countries like the UK where it's publicly funded. In fact, talking of the UK, I'm already getting referrals from GPs whose patients have gone out to get a private scan, which has picked up something incidental. They're being referred into the hospital even though they feel completely fine. One of my vascular surgical colleagues has said that his clinic is getting inundated with patients who've had scans of their carotid artery in places like supermarket parking lots where little vans set up ready to part you from your cash. And he tells them the same thing every time, that if you haven't had a stroke, there's nothing to do except the usual sensible health advice. Hello, this is Future Rohin from across the Beardiverse, Barbus Medius, jumping in as I think I glossed over this a little bit. It's not just relevant to the UK. All countries have publicly funded healthcare to some extent. In fact, the US spends more of their GDP on health, with worse outcomes, I might add, than any other country. So anything that increases the tax money spent on unnecessary medical care is bad news for everybody who pays tax. So although we tend to think about health as our own concern, if you're a taxpayer, you should also not want your health system clogged up unnecessarily. Now, I believe everyone should be able to spend their money on whatever useless thing they like, but with homeopathy or athletic greens, the taxpayer doesn't have to deal with the consequences. All right, back to India Rohin, aka Dari Minimus. And this is why full-body scans are not recommended by the FDA or the NHS or any medical organization. Remember, this is doctors turning down lucrative work, so you can't claim that this is some kind of conspiracy from the medical industry. Online commenters are always very ready to point out when pharma is enriching themselves, and I agree with a lot of those complaints and join in, but they seem to have a blind spot when it comes to these private startups. Suddenly then they don't notice the overt financial conflicts of interest, and they're very ready to hand over their cash. Recently, I put up a YouTube community post asking why people even watch this channel, and one of the replies was that they like the fact that I don't tell people what to do, but I try to help others reach decisions. And I really liked reading that, and I definitely do try to think that way. I genuinely do believe that patients should be free to make whatever good or bad decisions they want, and my role is just to try and provide them with good information. So what I'm not arguing for is a ban on these companies at all. In fact, I found a quote from a friend of mine from 2015 when I was researching this article, which I've written pretty quickly on holiday, by the way, but My friend is called Saurabh Jha. He's a radiologist and an author. So as a radiologist, he really understands the ins and outs of these scans much better than I do. And he was actually having a back and forth with Mark Cuban on Twitter, who was promoting asymptomatic screening blood tests. Can you see how things don't really change over time, and it's often the same kind of people promoting these things. And he said, if I put my physician cap on, then I realize that this is all just humbug, bordering on quackery. But then I have another cap, which is a sort of libertarian cap, which is that people can do whatever the hell they want with their organs and their money. And amusingly, Cuban asked why all the people criticizing the idea of scans and things are radiologists in the replies, and especially when this would make demand for their services skyrocket. And I just thought, that is quite amusing that the people who specialize in these scans, who know the complications of these scans, and who stand to benefit from more scans happening, are the ones warning against the complications of these scans. Do you think maybe there is something to that? Am I going to claim that nobody has ever been helped by these companies? Of course not. There will always be some unlucky, lucky people. But just because lottery winners feature in lottery adverts, it doesn't mean that if you play the lottery, you're going to win. In fact, it's more likely that you will lose your money and the lottery company will get richer. So, after all this, if you're still tempted to keep up with the Kardashians and part with your Cashian and scan your Ashian, sorry, these aren't vintage jokes, but I'm going to play the holiday card again. All I ask is that these companies are better regulated. So they can't promise things that they're unable to deliver. They can't gloss over the risks. They're mandated to consent patients. People, I don't even want to call them patients. You shouldn't make yourself into a patient if you don't need to be. That they are mandated to consent people for all the risks that we've talked about today. So it is totally understandable if you are emotionally swayed by the stories that these companies and their supporters come out with. And perhaps you've got personal reasons why you want to get one of these scans, and I'm not judging that at all. But remember that there are lots of cognitive biases at play that reinforce the positives and downplay the negatives in your head. Do you really want to risk getting tangled up in the system, becoming a patient, spending money, facing years or maybe months of anxiety, maybe having difficulty getting insurance? I don't. People sometimes ask if I'm ever tempted to hop into one of my own machines at work to get my heart scanned. I've got loads of friends who could easily take a look. I could probably get it done on the cheap, maybe even for free, and yet I don't. Because in the absence of symptoms and risk factors, touch wood, I'm very lucky that I'm in good health. I've got no risk factors at all. Now, that may not be the case for everybody. If you are an overweight 55-year-old smoker with diabetes and high cholesterol and you're getting chest tightness when you're going up the stairs, please, for the love of God, go and get investigated. But for someone like me, then what is a scan going to tell me? How is it going to change my behavior? It's either going to say I've got a bit of narrowing in my arteries or I don't. There is no indication for me to start treatment at the moment in the absence of symptoms or risk factors. So all it's going to do is satisfy some academic interest. I already know what I need to be doing, the highest yield things to improve my health. Eat well, lots of fruit and vegetables, exercise frequently, get good sleep, continue not to smoke, all the things I already know. Multiple studies have looked at actually whether telling people health advice based on personalized information, either from scan results or even from DNA profiling, versus a group who just got generic health advice based on guidelines, to see whether it made any difference. And spoiler alert, it didn't. No matter how personalized and detailed the information was, the behavioral change was the same in both groups. Getting a scan doesn't make you a saint overnight. I know that occasional Five Guys that I order isn't good for me, but sometimes you just want to get a bit of junk food, and it's called making a informed, rational decision as an adult about things that are good and bad for you. I already know it's bad for me. In fact, a normal scan might finish me off. A pristine set of coronary arteries might be like carte blanche, green light for me to just eat whatever I want. I'd be gobbling Five Guys every night. All right, I think I'm going to get accused of queerbaiting with that line. In medicine, we have a mantra: don't do a test if it's not going to change your management. I totally get the curiosity of just wanting to know what's going on inside your body, and now it's available to the general public like never before. It's great that so many people have an interest in their health, but you already know the highest yield things that you can be doing for your health, and it's concentrating on the basics. Eat well, sleep well, exercise well, socialize well, mental health well. I know I sound flippant when I say these, but these take work. Sometimes health advice can be really overcomplicated, and a lot of the stuff that the health influencers say, if you read between the lines, it's quite unpleasant. There'll be a lot of messages about avoiding processed food and only buying organic food and forest bathing and open water swimming and skiing in Aspen and all these kinds of things. And I'm not saying that any of those are bad advice, but what they're really saying is come from a wealthy background, have lots of disposable income, live in a good area, and have healthy genes. And it's frustrating to think about those things which have a big impact on our health, but try to focus on the things that you can change rather than things you can't. And I think what these scans sometimes offer is the illusion of control. They feel like you're doing something, but I want to try and tell you that you can do loads of things which are a lot cheaper and much more effective than spending your money on these kinds of tests. So if life hasn't dealt you a royal flush of all those fantastic things, and you don't have access to a time machine or buried treasure, instead focus your energies on the things you can change, the things that really make an impact. I know I could do much better. Few of us really hit them properly, and I know better than most how important they are. So I'm going to go now, and I'm going to sweat even more running around an only mildly polluted local lake where I share the running path with all the older couples who power walk round together, which is really cute and lovely to see. And then I'm going to go to the open-air fitness park where the only other people seem to be one auntie who really gives it some, and kudos to her, but also a bunch of IT guys from the Wipro office opposite who just seem to sit on the machines and text each other. It's mysterious. But anyway, I could, only once I'm really satisfied that I've hit all of those main pillars, sleep is another one I could do much better, would I worry about these additional window dressings. I wish you the best of health. I am back in the UK. I'll let you guess how much time elapsed between segments based on beard growth. Closest answer wins the much coveted YouTube comment creator fave. Could be a few weeks, could be a few hours, who's to say? Answer below. And remember that a fave from Medlife Crisis was shown to be non-inferior to placebo in a non-randomized pilot study. Admittedly, the secondary outcome of mortality was significantly higher in the faved group, and the authors noted that, interestingly, in this case, correlation definitely was causation. Now, friends, my day job is increasingly devouring my soul and leaving a gaping chasm deep inside of me. Now, this is not a complaint, but somehow I am now lead for my whole department. I don't know how this happened. I hate doing work. But to make it more bearable, I've been insisting that everybody uses the American title for my post, Chief of Cardiology, and they greet me by saying, "Hail to the Chief." So far, nobody has complied, and frankly, I think this is why the health service is falling to pieces in the UK. But what I'm trying to say here is, I'm finding it harder and harder to make videos, which sucks because I really like doing it. And obviously I've got family commitments that come first too, so I'm even more grateful than ever to be supported by Nebula, who are sponsoring this video. Now, Nebula is where you can see all of my videos ad-free and early. This video's already been there for 3 weeks, actually. They allow me to make my video a viable second career, and my hope is maybe one day make it feasible for me to perhaps devote more time to it. I really would love to see that happen, and I've got Nebula to thank for allowing me to keep doing this. And just for September, You've only got about a week to do this because I'm so much slower than the other Nebula creators. I'm very sorry, but we are running a special scheme. For those of you who don't know, Nebula is a streaming service for your computer or device or TV that I and a group of independent content creators started up a few years ago, and it's where we can make content that we really want to without worrying about all the uncertainty of putting things on YouTube, which of course is a platform that we don't run. There are hundreds of videos that you can find only on Nebula, and that number is growing every day. I've put some extra content there myself. You can see the runaway success cultural phenomenon that is jet lag on Nebula first. And there are Nebula Originals, premium quality videos produced by Nebula that are only available there, like Real-Time History's fascinating multi-part dive into Soviet nuclear history, Red Atoms, and Nebula is the only place you can find Lindsay Ellis's content now. She's got a great new video all about Jurassic Park, comparing the movie to the book, and the fact that the movie's turning 30 years old, which makes me feel very old. So for September only, we are offering lifetime memberships, which are what they sound like: unlimited access to Nebula for as long as you live, which, provided you have a daily full-body MRI, could be forever. We're offering this for $300, and when we did this earlier in the year, we were blown away how many people signed up. You see, a large chunk of that $300 goes to the creator whose link you use. Now, I never direct anybody to Patreon, but this way, you're not just helping me, you're getting access to way more content than just mine. So follow the on-screen link. But I will say the cheapest way for you to sign up is by using my link to get 40% off the annual subscription, which works out at only $30. Lifetime membership is about supporting what we're trying to achieve together, a home for independent, uncensored, great content, and to help me keep making videos and making better videos. But annual membership is just the best deal in streaming right now, honestly. So if you enjoy the stuff I make, please check out the links below. And if you want to get 10% off a full body scan with bonus colonoscopy chucked in for free, use my discount code AskCrisis to make sure you get full cecal penetration.